ago, they valued their fame, their individual fame. They valued their individual influence. So for them to then settle into having people go with them, walk with them, talk with them, that wasn't really their scene. They like to be seen, not heard. And now you've got Jesus with, for lack of a better term, an entourage. He's got these guys with him. He's got Andrew, and he's got Peter, and he's got Philip, and he's got Nathaniel, and he's got apparently a handful of others as well. And I thought this was interesting. I thought when you look at the first two verses of John chapter 2, you see what I call the normalcy of Jesus. The normalcy, the humanity, the regular, everyday person. Because verses 1 and 2 of chapter 2 tell you that Jesus simply is going to a wedding. There's nothing, on the outset, there's nothing about this wedding that's surprising, shocking, or anything in between. It's Jesus is going to a wedding, and he's going with his friends. It's the same exact thing that anybody would say. They had plans this weekend with their friends. That's all that you have going on here. Now, obviously, we know that there's more coming in this story, but I thought one of the first things that jumped out at me was how often do we get to see Jesus in a normal, what I would call human setting? It's just not that often. It seems like every story, every account about Jesus, just very rarely do we get to see him in this sort of light. I can think of a couple off the top of my head, but there's just not very many. One, when he's on the ship and he's sleeping below deck, he's just wanting to enjoy this time, and he's wanting to take a rest. He's tired. That's just normal. That's human. I think about in John 11, when he wept over the loss of Lazarus. I think there was more to it than just weeping over the loss of a friend. But again, there's some normalcy there. But there's just not very many there's just very few often times that Jesus is just like one of us, or just like one of them in that day. And this is one of those moments. There's nothing that tells you at the outset that this is some unique, crazy, strange, prophetic scenario. He's just going to a wedding with his friends. And this wedding apparently was a family affair, because for Mary to be involved like she was, in verse 3, you see the mother of Jesus being asked to deal with the fact that the wine has run out. For that to be the case in that day, she had to have been kin to one of the wedding party. And more than likely, they were kin to the bridegroom or the groom, because it was the groom's responsibility to put on the meal. So in some way, Jesus is connected, whether it be cousins. I'm not sure exactly how it all breaks down, but he is familial relation to the person being married here. So it's literally like you loading up your family and going to a wedding. Somebody in your family, a cousin, a niece, a nephew, somebody's getting married. Hey, you need to go. You need to go and support them. Hey, there's going to be some good food. That's what you got going on here. It's just normal. Everything about it's normal. He's invited as a family member, and this is a social event. And he wants these guys to come with him, which I think is really, I don't know what the right word would be, neat, cool, whatever word you want to use there. It's just neat that Jesus has these guys that are just kind of just now his friends. Because if you look at verse 1, it says on the third day. So the third day of what? The third day from when? Well, from my understanding, this is the third day from since he met them and they started following him. So these are brand new friends. These are brand new acquaintances. Now, Jesus kind of insinuates that he knows who Nathaniel is. If you go back to chapter 1 and verse 48, Nathaniel says, "How do you know me?" And he says, "Before Philip called you when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." So apparently Jesus kind of knows who these guys are, whether or not they're close and they're friends. But he knows who these people are. But these are still new acquaintances, new followers. And Jesus says, "I'm going to this wedding. It's a family member. Why don't you guys go with me?" It's nice to be included, right? Everybody likes to feel like they're a part of something. One of the things that I learned and have learned as a coach is that you need to spend at least a little bit of time with the guy that sits on the end of the bench to make him feel like he's part of the team. The interesting thing about coaches is it's amazing what they'll do for someone who can't do anything for them in return. I've had players like that. I've had kids be on my teams that I've kept on my teams who, when the game came down to the final few moments and it's nip and tuck and it's a 2-minute game, it's a It's all down to this last 2 minutes. Those guys weren't going to get in the game. But I loved having them on the team because they were great guys, or they were people that needed to be in that setting. And I didn't know that early in my career, but I learned that. And there have been some incredible moments that I've had as a coach where a kid that maybe didn't get to play much all year has a big moment somewhere down the line. I can think of one, and off the top of my head, we were playing a game against a much larger school, and our two best players were out of the game. They were injured. And this school had a kid that plays in Alabama now, a kid that played at Sanford that we were playing against, and they were very, very, very good. And they had beat us really badly by about 35 points the first game of the season, and we had our two best players then. So we were just kind of expecting, when we show up at this game, it's going to get ugly, and it's going to get ugly fast. This is going to be one of those where they run the clock the whole fourth quarter, and we're happy with it. We're just fine. And lo and behold, we get to the fourth quarter. We're down by 5 points somehow. We've hung around with a bunch of guys that honestly never played. They've played big minutes. They've scored a couple of good buckets. They've played some great defense. And all of a sudden, we get to the last 30 seconds of the game, and the head coach and I look at each other and just sort of laugh because we look at our lineup that's on the floor and we think, when did you ever think we put those 5 kids on the floor against this school with 3 Division I athletes and 2 Division II athletes, and they're starting 5. We wound up tying the game, going to overtime. With about 10 seconds to go in overtime, the other team is ahead by 1 point. They throw an errant pass on an inbounds. One of our kids who never played steals it, throws it to another kid who makes a layup, and we wound up winning by 1 point in overtime with what I would call, and what I did call in the locker room, the island of misfit toys. We had no business winning that game, but that was a huge moment, and that came because us as a coaching staff spent time with the number 11 and 12 guys, just like we did with the number 1 and 2 guys. I love the fact that Jesus appears, and I know he is normal, but he's not normal. And he knows that. And even in his abnormality, even as the Messiah, the Son of God, he understands the need to make those guys feel included. So he grabs these guys and says, hey, I got to go to this wedding. You guys just come with me. It's a really neat moment. I've always thought this was just I'm always focused on the miracle aspect of it, which we're going to in just a minute, but I've always focused on that aspect of it, and I've ignored the first part of this story. Now, the second part of the first part, okay? First part, you have Jesus going to a wedding. Normal friend behavior. Hey, I'm going, you guys go with me. The second part of the first part is what a lot of people consider to be Jesus being disrespectful. And if you don't know much about Jesus, you read verses 3 and 4, and your assumption is, why is he being so rude to his mother? And I want you to know it's not disrespect. Let's set the scene first of all. Let's read verses 3, 4, and 5. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And Jesus said to her, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. The first thing you need to know is running out of wine at a wedding is not an option in this day. That is just not an option. It can't happen. You can't run out of wine. That's the one thing you can't do. If you're in charge of the party, the one thing that can't happen is you can't run out of wine. Now, you and I could have a discussion about whether this was alcoholic wine or whatever. We can discuss that later. But the bottom line is, if you're the one in charge, you can't let this happen. So Mary is up against what we would consider severe humiliation. If she can't produce wine, this is about to go south in a big hurry. It's why she comes to Jesus. I've always thought it was interesting that Mary goes to him. Now, if you go back and from the very beginning when Jesus was born, it says that Mary treasured things or pondered things about Jesus from the time he was born. When he was 12 and he asked those questions in Luke 2, when he was standing in the temple and he was confusing even the wisest of the group with his questions, she still looked upon him and thought, there's something I'm not getting here. Something different about him. And here you find out that she kind of realizes there's something different about him. She knows there's something different about him, and she goes to him. when something bad happens. Somebody comes to her and says, we are out of wine, and her first instinct isn't to panic. Her first instinct is to go to Jesus. And her simple statement, verse 3 says, they have no wine. That's it. Now, she didn't say, I need you to make more. She didn't say, I need you to go buy more. Verse 5 tells you why she didn't say those things. It is her response to what Jesus is about to say that tells you everything you need to know about their relationship. Her statement, they have no wine. Her response after his statement, do whatever he tells you. She didn't know what he was going to do. She wasn't sure what was going to happen, but here's what she did know. If I put my full trust and my full faith in him, he'll do something. Now, obviously, the life application is a really simple one. How many times have you put your full faith and your full trust in Jesus? I don't really know what to do, but I'm going to turn to Jesus. You realize how simple our lives would be if that was our response to everything that happened, positive or negative. If we just simply said, I'm really not sure what he's going to do, but I know that I need to go to him. And I need to go to him first. And I need to go to him completely. She didn't try to go, hey, look, let's see if we can get some more. Let's mix some water in there and let's try to, because that's what they did in that day. If they started running low, they just ran and got a pitcher of water, poured it in there, and it weakened the juice, the wine down, but it made it last longer, just like my mom did when I was little, and we would have white beans and cornbread. Well, we made sure that everybody had enough. You add another jar of water to the beans to make sure they last a little bit longer. That's what they did back in that day, is they just added more water, and eventually you're basically drinking water with just a hint of wine, but even that has run out. And Mary says, I don't know what to do, but I know who does know what to do, so I'm going to go to him. So she does. This could have had a long-lasting effect on Mary as a mother. It could have had a long-lasting effect on Mary as a family member. I mean, this is, again, someone in her family's wedding. And if she doesn't provide, it's going to come back on her. Now, let's look at what Jesus says in verse 4 that people deem so disrespectful. Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. See, people try to take Jesus to task here because of his perceived attitude toward his mother. However, this comment is not a tone of disrespect as much as it is a definitive explanation of the roles they would be filling from this point forward. For her role is now a woman in need of a Savior. For him, his role, the Savior of the world. Up until this point, Jesus has been her boy, her oldest, her firstborn, not her favorite, but definitely her most peculiar child. See, some people try to make Jesus out to have been a superhero, that from the time he was born, he was doing magic tricks and he was lifting cars like Superman and he was flying around as though he was some sort of DC comic, Marvel comic combination. That's not the case. If you read Luke 2 very carefully, what you find about Jesus is he was born and he was raised just like every other child. He was raised the son of a carpenter, which meant that he learned to work with his hands from a very early age, which meant that he did manual labor from a very early age, which meant that there were moments when he was a child that he fell and he scraped his knee. There were moments as a child where he hit his thumb with a hammer. There were moments as a child where he probably didn't get done what he was supposed to get done when he was supposed to get it done, but he had a great attitude about it the entire time. Luke 2 tells us he was submissive in all things. From the time he was born, he's been her baby. And at this moment, their entire relationship changes. And some people read this and they think that he's being disrespectful, but when he says woman, he's not being disrespectful. It's not an accusatory tone. It's not a means of disrespecting her or putting her in her place, quote unquote. No, what he did was he was reminding her that he had a far greater role than being her son. Woman, what does this have to do with me? Some people read that and they read that question and they assume that Jesus is questioning her even coming to him. That's not at all. If you read the second statement, it tells you everything you need to know. My hour is not yet come. That is him explaining to her, you need to understand that when we start this road, it's going to end in a really tragic, devastating way. That once this starts, I can't stop it. Once this begins, I'm not going to be able to put a stop to this. You understand? Once I do this, people are going to start asking questions. People are going to want to know more. Once I do this, I'm no longer your son in the sense that I have been. If you were here, I believe it was Sunday night when Dylan got up to read Scripture. He read when Jesus was speaking about who is my mother and who is my brothers. See here, these people who do the will of my Father, that's my mother and that's my brothers. You see, that's a perfect reflection of the position that now Jesus and Mary are in. Mary says they have no more wine, and Jesus says, I know what you're wanting. You're wanting me to do something about it, but you need to understand what I'm about to do about it to fix it. It's going to create some problems for you. Earthly problems, not spiritual problems. It's going to create some earthly problems for you. Those problems culminate as she stands at the foot of the cross and she watches as they nail her son to a piece of wood. And she watches him bleed out. Those problems culminate as she watches Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea take his body down off of the cross and put it in a tomb. It all started right here. So when you read Jesus' statement, don't read it as him talking to his mother anymore. He's talking to a woman in need of a Savior. Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour is not yet come. Thanks be to God, he has 3.5 years post this conversation to do so many things that John in John chapter 20 is going to say, look, nobody could write down all the things that he did. It's not physically possible. Thanks be to God, he gave him 3 to 3.5 years before people killed him. But that's what he's telling her in this comment. It is not disrespectful. It's not rude. It's not ugly. It is very pointed that their relationship is changing. Now, let's look at the miracle. The miracle itself is incredible. Verse 6, there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. They filled them up to the brim, and he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine until now. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. Here's what you need to know. The miracle in and of itself, it's incredible, but I don't want that to be the focal point because that's what I have done in this study of this particular section. I've done that for as long as I can remember. I've looked only at the miracle, and I haven't looked at the aftermath. The miracle itself baffles a professional master of feasts. It's his job. We would consider this person to be, I guess, maybe a party planner, somebody who is so well versed in the culture that they know what's good and what's not. They would be the people you would ask, is this good to serve together at a party? Should you do this and this and this? Should you have this and this? What would you require? What Jesus converts the water to is so good that it's this professional master of parties, this master of feasts who says, look, I need to know what's going on here. The people who served it to him don't tell him. So he just goes straight to the source. He goes right to the groom. He says, look, this is unheard of. This is unheard of. Every feast I've ever been to, they serve the best first, and then as people drink along, they just kind of give them whatever's left. The equivalent would be if you and I were serving sweet tea, all right? And it was coming out of this big vat, this big old jar, massive, let's say 50-gallon drum, and we had poured ice in it to keep it cold. The first several glasses that you served would be some of the best sweet tea you've ever put in your mouth. But as the party goes on, the ice begins to melt and it begins to water down the tea that's in it. And so by the time you get to the last few glasses, people are like, this isn't even really tea anymore. It's just water with just a little hint of something in it. And this master of feast says, you've done the exact opposite. You've served kind of the middle ground stuff, the worst stuff, and you saved the best for last. He doesn't understand. It's a miracle. The miracle is incredible, but it serves a far deeper purpose, and it's the aftermath that I want us to close with tonight. This miracle is part of the revelation of who Jesus is and what his purpose is while he's here on earth. It created an overwhelming sense of relief, in my opinion, as the disciples could finally breathe, knowing they had chosen and followed the true Messiah. You see that in verse 11. There's one little sentence that John throws in at the end of verse 11 that seemingly doesn't fit. It seems like if his disciples were following him, then they already believed in him. But here John says in verse 11 that after this miracle and his disciples believed in him. You see, they're human. They still weren't sure. But when they saw what they saw, they knew. They knew. The faith that is built based on this first miracle would carry them through the rest of their days and experiences with Jesus. Not only while he was here on earth, but even afterwards. It would lead them to die for his cause. It started here. One other point that I want to make is in verse 11, where it says, this, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory. Basically what that means is that is the answer, that is the add-on to his response to his mother. When he said, my time has not yet come, that was more of a warning sign than it was anything. And when you get to the end of verse 11 and it says that he manifested his glory, that was him saying, here we go. You've heard the cliche, you can't unring a bell, right? That once the bell's rung, it's been rung. This was the ringing of the bell. You can't unring a bell. That's what Jesus is telling his mother. Once this starts, you need to understand what's coming. It's not going to slow down. It's not going to hold up. It's not going to get any better. The bell's rung. He manifested his glory. His disciples believed in him. Verse 12 is kind of the last peaceful moment he's going to have. Verse 12 says that he and his disciples, his mother and his brothers, they went to Capernaum and they had a few days together. And for all intents and purposes, that's basically the last normal moment Jesus is going to have. It all started here. We're not going to sing an invitation song like we normally would. I just want you to know that the invitation's always open. The application of this particular lesson really is kind of simple, but it's one that we certainly need to be familiar with, and that is the simple fact of, have we put our faith and trust in Jesus completely? His mother did that. When she went to ask that question, it was really simple. She knew that Jesus would do something. She wasn't sure what, but she knew she could trust him. The same for us today. The second thing is realizing in the position we're in this particular story, talking about the story of Jesus, realizing that this was the starting point. This was the beginning. This was the bell being rung. That's important for us as we move forward in the story. I am so glad you joined us online, those of you that did that. Those of you that were able to get out and be with us tonight, I'm so glad to see you, glad that you were here. Lyndall's going to come up and lead us in a close.